is one of the founders of a new, and I think exciting initiative called the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. Nice Catholic idea, common good. And before that, Rick was 10 years as Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals. He left in 2008, and he's especially recently brought evangelicals and scientists together on the search for common ground in climate change. In fact, he was a participant in the Climate Forum 2002 in Oxford. They produced the Oxford Declaration. He helped to create the Evangelical Climate Initiative in 2006, and the New York Times has dubbed him the Earthy Evangelist. And my favorite magazine cover was Vanity Fair. What year was that, Rich? 2005. Had Rich Cizik without his suit and tie and nice shirt, barefoot over an ice block that was melting in a little tub of water on the cover of Vanity Fair. That was one of your high points, I thought, in penetrating the mass media. Time has listed Rich as one of the Time 100 most influential people. In 2006, Fast Company placed him on his list of most creative minds. He's written lots of articles, editorials. Beyond all that great stuff, I want to say that Rich Cizik was one of those early people who had what he called an epiphany on the issue of climate change. And it actually took him deeper into his faith, and has been one of the most articulate people on our topic for these 2 weeks. So I'm very pleased to give you a chance to meet and hear my good friend Rich Cizik. He's going to stay with us for the whole 2 hours, so give him a warm welcome.
Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you, Jim. There was a time when Jim Wallis and I would be on the opposite sides of the religious debate here in Washington. I think it's pretty clear. Wouldn't you say that, Jim? So I did serve as 10 years as Vice President at the National Association of Evangelicals in the Office for Governmental Affairs here in Washington, but I actually served prior to that 18 years with the association. That becomes important because it's a little bit of the history that I bring. And it will help illustrate the shifts which I think we need to make as a people, as a nation, as faith communities. By the way, how many in this group would call themselves Catholic? Oh, what, 5, 6, 7, is that right? How many would call themselves Protestant? Well, goodness gracious, 2, 3 hands. Any would you call yourselves evangelicals? Not a single one. Well, what? Muslim. Any Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist? Few hands. Well, what an eclectic group with one major missing community, the evangelicals. So I will be the evangelical. Jim, do you want to be the other evangelical? I will be the other evangelical. I was prompted to begin with a quote from Lord of the Rings and Gandalf. Would you permit me to do so? Not with a scripture verse, but with Gandalf, who describes what I would like to say for you as a new form of leadership. Here it is. Listen carefully. The rule of no realm is mine. But all worthy things that are in peril, as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair and flower and bear fruit in the days to come. For I too am a steward. Did you not know? Now, not a bad maxim. I would add, in the end, it was the fun-loving, unassuming little hobbits who took on their shoulders the awesome task I'm about to describe for you. And they were scared. They didn't know which way to go. But in the end, you see, all the kings and warriors and wizards could only stand by as the little people saved the world. Did you all see it? Do you remember it? I would like to say to you this afternoon that we need a new form of leadership, that we are at a crisis. It's at one point in human history that we have never been to before that we now face. And I will describe that too. But first of all, about those faith communities, I like this, since there were a disproportionate number of Catholics. Richard John Neuhaus, the late Catholic priest, convert from Lutheranism, who wrote First Things as editor and was a frequent critic of Jim Wallis, and in more recent years, quite a critic of yours truly. But he did say a few things I happen to agree with, and one of them was this. He says, the very structure of being quote-unquote evangelical and being Catholic could hardly differ more sharply. And he was echoing what a well-known evangelical Notre Dame by the name of Mark Noll has also said, where he says there are two, Noll put it this way, only two, quote, quite different forms of Christianity, that being Protestantism and Catholicism. Only two, he says. And they're constantly trying to sort this out, not just the Catholics and the Protestants, but especially among the evangelicals. Who is one of them or one of us? But he does say the very structure could hardly be more sharply, and he distinguishes the two as follows. He says, and this is your theology, a little bit of theology to begin. It's the place to begin. I tell my sons, the four most important words in the Bible are the first four. Does anybody care to guess what they are? You know your Genesis, do you not? In the beginning, God. So in the beginning, we will begin with theology. But he says, that is, Neuhaus does, that evangelicalism accents the doctrinal, the core beliefs, the affective, and usually the moral. Catholicism accents the communal, the ecclesial, the aesthetic, sacramental, joined to a mix of the moral and aesthetic. And he goes on to say something which I don't know that I agree with, I may disagree with, but he says it, leave it for you to think it through. He says, an evangelical recognizes Catholics as brothers and sisters in Christ. The evangelical recognizes Catholics as brothers and sisters in Christ, adding, despite their being Catholic, because they witnessed a saving relationship with Christ. And he says Catholics recognize evangelicals as such because they are validly baptized into Christ and therefore into his holy body, the church, however imperfect their communion with the church may be. And put differently, Neuhaus concludes, he says, evangelicals recognize Catholics as Christians because they are by profession really evangelicals. Do you hear that? You really are, if you are a Catholic, really. And Catholics recognize evangelicals as Christians because they are by sacramental grace really Catholics. So the distinctions which we are wont to make between Protestants, Catholics, even evangelicals and others, it is a distinction, one being doctrinal, the other being sacramental and communal. But in the end, ultimately, we share more than we happen to disagree with each other upon, and thus we call each other's Christians. Even if some evangelicals say, at the expense of, being Catholic, you are a Christian, some evangelicals would say. I happen to believe, and I'll close with this in a few minutes, that it's only in a new ecumenism that evangelicals are part of that we're going to be able to address probably the most significant issue that faces the planet that I want to talk about, called climate change, the environment. And it's why Jim has invited me here. And he probably never would have anticipated ever that Rich Cizik would do this. Would you have ever anticipated in my years, Jim, associated with the evangelicals, that you always had high hopes for me? But this is my story. It goes like this. I had worked beginning in 1980. Ronald Reagan was elected in 80. I came here from seminary, having pursued advanced degrees in political science for the better part of 10 years, then gone to seminary, came here to work for the National Association of Evangelicals in 1980. And for the better part of 20 years, I have to willingly confess to you, the environment never crossed my agenda. Now, mind you, I was the vice president for governmental affairs. And for the association, the governmental affairs office was sort of like the cart pulling the horse. And evangelicals are this community in America that Gallup says number approximately 100 million people, at least 50 to 60 million, inasmuch as they say, as evangelicals, first of all, we believe the Bible is the authoritative Word of God. That is the doctrinal. Remember I said that? Second of all, they would attest to a born-again experience that have been rejuvenated by the Holy Spirit into a new relationship with God. That's the so-called born-again experience that evangelicals are known and famous for. And thirdly, they share their faith with others. And Gallup says that this community represents 60 to 70 at a minimum. On an election day, 1/4 of all people going into the voting booths today are evangelicals. 1/4, 25%. And if you start adding up the kids, since evangelicals like Mormons proliferate, maybe Catholics do too, I guess that's true, upwards of 100 million. 1/3, Gallup would say, of America are these evangelicals. And I had been representing this movement for approximately 2 decades, and the most compelling thing I can say about it is that while I had distinguished myself in many ways, there was one issue which I was apprised of the fact I wouldn't touch, shouldn't touch, and didn't touch, and that was the environment. And so when I was invited by Sir John Houghton in 2002 to go to Oxford, England, for purposes of a climate change conference, I was told by my board members, who sort of monitored me, don't go. I said, why not? They said, because I think you'll just hear one story on the climate debate. Well, I went. And I willingly say now, I had a conversion. And I use that word because there's only one word that can typify adequately the shift that occurred in my own heart and mind. That before, it was not an issue that even entered onto my platform, you see, my panoply of issues, the palette that I worked from on a daily basis, directing governmental affairs. Environment never even made it onto the palette. I went to the conference and I was, in a certain sense, as John Wesley said, the founder of Methodism, my heart was warmed in a strange way to believe differently about the world. Now, Margaret Mead has said, nobody likes to change. The only one who does, she says, is a wet baby. A wet baby wants changing. But she says nobody else really wants to change. And I had been told that to go into this debate of environment would be divisive. It would hinder my witness. In other words, as we are sometimes told by parents, don't go there. And I had been told to don't go there. And I went. I heard the evidence over 4 or 5 days, and I came away changed. And one of the most compelling convictions I had was, among other things, that this was a defining moment in human history. Now you could say, well, why is it a defining moment? Scientists and climatologists say it's a defining moment in human history because, well, man 230,000 years ago learned how to control fire to heat his food and warm his body and stave off disease. And that 230,000 years ago was one of those defining moments. 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution took that fire, that capacity, turned it into steam and created the Industrial Revolution. And that power from the steam engine was later transferred, you see, into electrical power and now nuclear power. And now we're at that stage in human history when we are doing something to the planet that has never been done before. And it's forcing us to evaluate energy. And what these same scientists are saying is that as you begin to think differently about energy in a society, everything else begins to change, even theology. Now, I would like to say to you, this is a defining moment because, among other things, this issue of what we face as a planet is not so much just about the science, although the science is compelling on climate change. It's not so much just even about economics, although the economics of it are very significant. You've been reading Van Jones and Green Jobs and the like, right? But most fundamentally, It is about us. Because we don't want to change. And the reality is, as G.K. Chesterton, a famous Catholic, said 100 years ago, he said, when asked, what is the problem with humanity? What did Chesterton respond? He said, me. He said, I am. And so fundamentally, climate change is about us. So I came away with a conviction that I had to change. And that vision, I would say, that shift that occurred to me was a theological one, in the sense that previously I would be what James Jones, who is the Archbishop of Liverpool, and what another fellow evangelical who is Anglican has written of in a new book about heaven and the planet. I was, as they write, really in effect what you are. If you haven't experienced this conversion, I would say to you here today, you are really a Neo-Platonist. Now you could say, well, no. As a Catholic, as a Protestant, or as an evangelical, we are followers, fundamentally of Jesus. Jesus said, follow me. And yet, what they're saying, theologians, is that when we minimize, in effect, the earth and its importance, we are Neo-Platonists. Why? Because Plato said that it is the form that is important. It is not the reality. It's the form. And in so doing, theologians are essentially saying that for 2,000 years, Christian people have lived following not Jesus himself, but following Plato, in saying that, well, this earth doesn't matter. What matters is the forms. And so the essential defining moment, the essential change that needs to occur, is you see that we don't live as believers in order to die and go into heaven. But the central framing question that you have to answer, I will have to answer for the rest of my life and into eternity, is, what is my relationship to God with respect to this earth? And I would suggest to you that if I did a test of you, each one of you, and gave it to you, I would say that you, in all likelihood, are living under a vision of this earth that's very anthropomorphic. It is not, as I would think you ought to have, in other words, Christocentric, but anthropomorphic and about man. And you wouldn't be much different than most others on this planet, I would say. Because we fundamentally, as fallen creatures, are driven by pride, apathy, and greed. And that is what drives us. And yet, that is very anthropomorphic. And the vision, you see, of living otherwise, beyond our humanness, is what fundamentally this challenge of climate change calls for. Okay. Why? Because if you have an anthropomorphic cultural bias, I would say, Christianity, fundamentally, your faith loses its relevance for the earth, and a secular utilitarian worldview emerges that turns the earth and all of its features and creatures into mere commodities. And what at first appears to be just a mere slight error becomes a monstrous wrong. What happened to me when I began to speak out was as follows. A well-known radio broadcaster went on the air after having visited Senator Jim Inhofe's office on Capitol Hill. And at the time, Senator Jim Inhofe was the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee. And he actually said on the air, James Dobson from Focus on the Family headquarters in Colorado Springs, he went on the air and said that Rich Cizik is being divisive. He is being anti-American. He must have an underlying hatred of America, and he must stop. So I had been speaking out beginning in 2002 about a new kind of relationship to the earth. And it provoked all kinds of pushback, including, you see, calls by major leaders within the religious right that I resign or be fired. And this went on for a number of years, as Jim and others would attest. At no small expense to me, I would say, personally, and to my family and otherwise. Really challenging if you have had a job for 20 years and somebody is saying that because you change your views on an issue like this, that you should either resign or be fired. Have you ever been fired? The rest of the story, as Paul Harvey says, is that in 2008, I gave an interview for Fresh Air on NPR, hosted by Terry Gross, in which I went too far. Among the other things that I said, in addition to the fact that we evangelicals had forsaken our responsibility to this new vision of caring for the earth, what we call creation care. It's a reframing that has never actually occurred in 2,000 years. You know, Bishop James Jones and others say, they cite, for example, Luke 6:13. Now, I grew up with this verse, that we should put our treasures not on things of this earth where moths and rust destroy and thieves steal, you see, but on the things of the next earth, the next new earth and a new heaven, where neither of those things occur. For where your treasure is, I was taught as an evangelical, there will your heart be also. And so it was the things of this earth I was told that were wrong. And what James Jones and others were saying was, begin to look at that verse differently and begin to see it, you see, as the earthing of heaven in a new way of sustainable thinking. After all, what is the definition of sustainable? I would ask you, who would care to offer? What is the definition of living sustainably? Any givers? Come on, you can help me out here. What? What do you think it means to live sustainably? Well, I'll offer, since there aren't any takers. Not a single taker. Come on. What Funk and Wagnall, you see, all the major dictionaries will say that sustainable means it does not die. It does not expire. And thus, you see, we are to live in a way, Jesus says, putting your treasure not on the things of this earth, but in the things to come. For where your treasure, there will your heart. Where there will your heart be also. And so, if things don't go extinct in heaven, maybe we should bring that ethic to this earth, which together we might call the earthing of heavenly values. And that is an entirely non-anthropomorphic vision, that we are to move our thinking from a mentality that says take from this earth, make things, and put the waste back into the earth, toward a new philosophy that goes, we're going to borrow from this earth, use those resources, and then return them to the earth in a fashion like we took them out, or replenishing the earth. And so the vision I would challenge you with is moving from take, make, and waste to borrow, use, and return. Now, what happened when I went on Terry Gross, by the way, you're having to endure this testimony which evangelicals are wont to give, in part because your teacher said, don't be afraid to tell it. That is my story. But what happened to me was I was fired. I said a couple of other things. I said I would be willing to support government-funded contraception as a means of abortion reduction. I said that I voted for Obama. Horror of horrors. No laughs. But fundamentally, I had said what was a verboten thing, namely that I had shifted the way I was thinking even about civil unions, and it cost me my job. And since that time, I have been creating the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, on the basis that we need just not a new vision, you see, that shifts from take, make, and waste to borrow, use, and return. A new vision, but we need a new strategy as well. But let me just say that the reason it's so hard, as evidenced by the surveys out even today of the Tea Party members who regard climate change as a cardinal, you see, denial of climate change as a cardinal truth. The reason I would suggest to you is really hard to shift is not just because climate change has become, you see, associated with science, and evangelicals, among others, believe that if scientists who believe in evolution are teaching it, that then we reject it because scientists are evolutionists and we reject evolution. Now that's an illogical syllogism if you've ever heard one. But we find that a lot of evangelicals reject it because they engage in straight line thinking. And straight line thinking says that A causes B, results in C, and ends up in D. In other words, straight line thinking is very much take, make, and waste. And what I would say to you is that systems-based thinking or sustainable-based thinking is very much borrow, use, and return. It's a mental frame that's very different. Borrow, use, and return. It affords, among other things, you see, unlike straight line thinking, that the unexpected can happen. You know, that's what, you see, systems-based thinking says. It's a little bit like this versus this. And it says the unexpected could be the black swans that happen. It could be the Katrinas. You see, all those things that happen in nature that we don't expect could be the black swans that systems-based thinking is better prepared to address, that straight-line thinking is not. Because straight-line thinking assumes that circumstances are predictable and they can be controlled. And systems-based thinking says, not so. You can't think linearly. And so we are at this defining moment in human history today in which we have released into the atmosphere carbon dioxide at about 385 parts per million, which James Hansen and other scientists now say is already beyond the tipping point. In 1995 and 2005, over 1,500 scientists from around the planet said that we've already degraded 2/3 of the ecological systems on the planet. Already degraded 2/3 of the ecological systems on the planet. And by pouring more and more CO2 in the atmosphere, having already passed, you see, not what was to be expected, the tipping point at 450 or 550 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, but already at 385. They now say we've already passed what is a tipping point of 350 parts per million, and we are already changing this planet in a way that will affect, as Christian Aid said, by 2050, 2 billion people. Now, the irony is that, according to surveys just out this morning, more than 43% of the GOP members of the Republican Party, refuse to believe the science of it, disputing it completely. And so sociological analysis indicates that both college educated, those that are in your crowd, as well as non-college educated Republicans dispute the science. Independents, well, To give you the precise figures, 23% of college-educated Republicans believe in the science of anthropogenic climate change. Do you follow me? 23% of college-educated. It's a bit higher, about 35% of non-college educated. Why? Because, they are less influenced by party. Bottom line, 75% of Democrats believe climate change is real and is anthropogenic. 75% of Democrats, and you see, in figures of 20 to 30%, you find the other party believing that. And you have to ask yourself, what in the world is going on? And I happen to believe that what is happening to millions of people in our country is what was happening to me. Namely, that the political party I was part of made it impossible for me to make the shift in thinking. Because I was told, don't think that way. I was told, don't go there. And so a kind of spatial systems blindness has, I believe, captured significant leadership in America. Spatial systems blindness that denies these realities. I mean, look at even the Obama administration's capacity to perceive what would happen in the Gulf of Mexico with offshore oil drilling weeks before the Gulf oil spill precipitated by BP, you see, and others. Just days prior to the blowing of a major oil well in the Gulf of Mexico that will forever change the Gulf, the Obama administration itself was willing to make a compromise about offshore drilling in a way that I think revealed its incapacity to perceive the unexpected. We all live with a kind of, I call it, out of sight, out of mind. Away is gone mentality. In other words, if it's gone from our gas tank gauge, it's gone. When it really isn't gone, as you well know. It's in the atmosphere. Or when it's not in our trash cans and it's picked up in the morning, it's gone to the earth. But it has not disappeared. And so we live, however, with a linear way of thinking as Christians. We live with a kind of take, make, waste linear model of behavior, an out of sight, out of mind. It's also a kind of quick fix thinking, which is the kissing cousin, I would say, from long-term thinking. And systems-based thinking looks at the long term. And what your generation is going to have to do is to begin to address this in ways that my generation is seemingly incapable of doing. Now, I happen to believe the strategy best capable of addressing this problem happens to be one, in part, which I initiated, namely a scientist and religious conversation, which we began in 2006 and brings scientists and evangelicals together to do this. Now, it's the illogical capacity, you see, of millions, upwards of, 50% of 70 million people in this country, their capacity, you see, to put this out of sight, out of mind, to live by a way of thinking which is counterproductive to the protection of the earth, which, you see, allows this to go on and allows politicians to do nothing. And the only strategy to begin to address politicians who behave this way is to hold them accountable. And so, if I hope to some degree articulated a different kind of vision, I would like to say as well a different kind of strategy. Some of you know that the Scopes monkey trial was held in 1925. And that was, of course, an event that led to the discrediting of American fundamentalists. It's an event which took place in Tennessee, and the consequences are still held to this day. And I would like to cite them as follows. I spoke at Lee University, approximately 4,000 students in chapel. A short distance, almost a few hours distance from where the Scopes Monkey trial was held. And I asked those students, how many of you have ever had a sermon on creation care? And would you care to guess how many? There were none. Now I have to be honest and say there were 2 or 3 football jocks in the front row who raised their hands and laughed and poked one another and made it quite apparent to me and to everyone around that they really hadn't ever had such a sermon. But out of 4,000 students at an institution called Lee University, a part of the Church of God denomination, there was nary a single hand of anyone who had such a sermon growing up. And so the question is, can we begin a new conversation 100 years after the Scopes trial between faith and science that would lead to different results? The results, of course, of that Scopes trial are held in the hands at Lee University. And so can we do something differently? I would like also to distribute copies of a document called Engaging Religious Communities Abroad. So I brought copies for everybody. So I'll just circulate them. And I would like to suggest to you that the answer to our dilemma, that is a strategy, is to begin to engage religious communities here and abroad. So it's not just a conversation with science to reverse this illogical syllogism I've described, but it's together with other religious communities to uphold what is within each of our traditions, this responsibility to care about the planet. And we found that, you see, whether you are Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, or otherwise, every tradition has within it this personal responsibility to care for the planet itself. And together, I would say, we can do this. But absent that kind of collaboration, we can never do it. And so restoring the climate and the physical environment of this planet Earth is a biological, yes, it's an economic, and it's a social necessity required for the survival, ultimately, of humanity itself. And that is why this is a defining moment. And if we don't have a strategy, we will fail. Have you ever heard the expression, a vision without a strategy is an hallucination? Have you ever heard that? Do you have a vision for something and not have a strategy? Well, if you don't have the strategy, you will never get to where you're going. And we can only begin to change our worldviews in this ecological crisis. We can only begin to change our worldview, I think, in collaboration with others, because they help us to see ourselves as we ought to be seen. Do you believe that? I happen to be among those who have participated at Copenhagen, and in December we'll go to Cancun for the climate meetings. Now, I'm not with the government bureaucrats, I would be quick to say, but with people of other faith groups who together believe we can do this. And they have enabled me to see, I think, what is required. Because, as I said, the problem is, in part, ourselves. In other words, I am the problem. And there is going to be an accounting, I would say, lastly, to each one of us, if we don't do this. Let me tell this story in closing. The father of a movement here of creation care is a professor of many, many years at the University of Wisconsin. And he went to the famous evangelist Billy Graham and asked him In all of your preaching, Dr. Graham, which spanned 60 years, have you ever preached a sermon on creation care? Was the question. And Cal DeWitt, the professor and grandfather of the movement, actually thought, from what he's told me, that Graham would say, oh yes, I have. But he said, no, in 60 years, I have to admit, I never have. Not one. And Cal DeWitt asked him what he thought of a verse in the Bible, the last verse in the Bible, Revelation 11:18, meant. And the verse goes like this: I will destroy those who destroy the earth. And Graham replied, I don't know what to think of that verse. I really don't know what. And I have been asked as well what the verse means. But what I believe it's saying to us is that we who are destroying the planet will be held accountable. And in fact, that accounting is already occurring now by what we're doing to ourselves. I will destroy those who destroy the earth is really about you and me and us. You see, if we can't make this great shift, if we can't get out of our iron cage thinking, if we can't get out of away is gone to there is no away, if we can't even get away, you see, from the idea that technology will save us. Now, I know at the Liverpool labs, they are testing new fusion technologies, that a small pellet, shot through by 192 different lasers at one time, Tom Friedman has wrote about, might produce this energy that exceeds the capacity of the sun. It might. But we can't count on it to do that. So technology itself may, but we can't count on saving us. We're going to have to save ourselves. Let me say one last story. It comes from C.S. Lewis, and it goes like this. A young minions in Hades, or hell, were being instructed by their senior official about their impending trip to planet Earth. And the senior devil said to the first young apprentice, he said, what will you tell them? He said, I will tell them there is no God. And the senior devil says, well, that's only so-so. He said, a lot of them already believe in God. And to the second, he said, what will you tell them? And he said, second one said, I will tell them there is no hell. And the senior said, well, a lot of them are already living in that hell. And to the third, he said, what will you say? And he responded, I will tell them there is no hurry. And the senior devil said, perfect, be on your way. And so the great temptation is to say to these challenges, there is no hurry. Politics in this town is virtual, and our response to the challenges are going to have to be equally virtual, and that is to be in politicians' faces for a long, long time in order to do this. And thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Okay, lots and lots and lots to talk about here. I'm glad Chesterton has already been invoked, and I'm glad you reminded us again, because a lot of the conversation that we've been having, I'm sorry, I always forget that. A lot of the conversation we've been having is what about us? What you felt after your conversion, I have to change. I said last week, after I was finished, that after we do a lecture, it's kind of over to you students. But this is more than any other topic, I think, over to you, I said, because the adults are not going to fix this, I don't think. And you said my generation is not going to fix this. So the question is, I like the way you focus on strategy. What's the strategy? Now, I said last week, and I'll say again, if people want to question science, you're welcome to do that. Nobody wanted to last week, the readings last week and this week, nobody did. You could still do that. This man is a resource on the science as well. But I think as I read your reflections on the paper, your reflections on the readings, you're thinking more, what's the strategy? Why didn't BP change us? Why didn't the needle move at all on energy? Why did the bad bill go down during the crisis? What's the strategy for generational change? And you said a couple of things that I thought I wanted to throw out to all of you. I heard you. I said last week, a new generation is going to be central to this. I think you'd agree. But also, you said a new engagement with the faith community will be central to the strategy. This course is faith, social justice, and public life. So, is in fact engaging the faith community. All of them, as Rich said, all of them have this in their deeply in their traditions. Is that central to success here?
Look at, Jim, I'll hand you the copy. I opened to the page 6. I know you're asking them, but I would ask you all to turn to page 6 and 7 and look at the trend lines, the major religion trends. You can see the 30-some different scholars who participated in the report at the back. But nonetheless, if you look on pages 6 and 7, you see, one, that the influence of religious groups is virtually affecting all sectors of society, from politics and culture to business and science. That's number one. Number two, that these changing patterns of religious identification are having significant political implications, even in places like China and India, where we know we face huge climate realities. 3, religion has both been benefited by and transformed by globalization, but it's also become a primary means of organizing opposition to globalization. The other factors you can look at, 4, 5, and 6, are that religion is playing an important place in countries, particularly where governments themselves lack capacity or legitimacy during periods of stress. It's used, that is, religion by extremists as a catalyst for conflict, but it's also a means of escalating tensions with other religious communities. You see that in Iraq. You probably found this in your discussion about war and peace. But I would also say, very importantly, that religion is deepening the significance and importance of religious freedom as a universal human right and a source of social and political stability. But very importantly, one of the presumptions, and if you look at the next few pages, you will see them. In fact, page 8, the presumptions are that, one, even while religion has been playing this role, organizing opposition to globalization, for example, even as a role as a catalyst, you see, in producing conflict, it is at the same time not only a problem, but should be viewed as a source of creativity, inspiration, commitment to human flourishing that provides enormous opportunities for the rest of the world. And a second presumption that U.S. strategy must avoid using religion instrumentally to manipulate foreign religious groups for our own nationalistic purposes. But on the other hand, if we only view it as a problem and not a solution to potential crises such as climate change, we make a big mistake. And you'll see, for example, I have a little bit of influence upon the document, but you'll see in the pages that follow reference, in fact, to how climate change is one of those issues which religious groups can collaborate together around, using the power of faith for positive purposes. But I don't want to shift away from your question, but
That's on.
I wanted to point that out.
On the question. Okay, let's fire back anything about what Rich said, but in particular, I'd like to utilize this time to think about strategy with Rich. The first time I heard your quote about vision without strategy is hallucination, I put it on my wall. Because our place is full of vision, sometimes without much strategy. So let's, anything you heard today, let's fire back, particularly if this is over to you, what's the strategy? I mean, what other than deciding to recycle in your personal lives and families, what's the strategy?
Other than to recycle. By the way, I call that the Catholic like the Catholic Hail Mary pass. You should do it as recycle,
Yeah.
but it's barely a start.
Hi. Have there been similar contentions about climate change in other religious groups abroad, like Christians in Europe?
Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, no. In other words, it's a unique American phenomenon, this adverse reaction to the science of climate change among evangelicals, at least. And so the evangelicals in Europe and elsewhere, India, China, look at the United States and say, truly amazing. What is happening that you're so blind to what is occurring to us? Because if all you have to do is look at the longitudinal lines of London, have you ever looked at a map and looked at where London is vis-a-vis Washington and New York, and how far north it is? If you look longitudinally, I think you'll find it's about Nova Scotia. If you've seen what rising sea levels will do, a mere 2 degrees centigrade rise will do to our nation's seaports is utterly astonishing and predicted by current emission levels to be a fact by 2100. Now you can dispute this, but those believers, for example, in England, they don't have this disputation over the science. And neither do they do amongst evangelicals around the world. And so you have to look at America and say, wow, what has happened?
When they ask you that, when they're amazed at that, what has happened? What's your answer? Why is this a unique?
One of my answers is that it took 100 years from the abolishment of the slave trade in the United Kingdom to the same to occur here. Now, 100 years. 100 years. How could people have been so blind for so long? And yet they were. Now, in England, it was the sugar cubes in their tea. In America, it was the cheap cotton for their clothes. And yet, will, I ask, our human successors look back 100 years from now and say, isn't it totally amazing that the United States Congress could so decisively reject action, and even by its leaders, on one party at least, even dispute the reality of the science? What will they say about us is the question.
Who's got the mic? Why don't you tell Rich your
Yeah, please tell me your name and where you come from.
I'm Andrew Dubbins. I'm a senior in the college, LA, California. My question was, along with that one, do you think opposition to climate change from the religious groups has any connection to funding by big energy? I was looking into this Cornwall Alliance for a paper I wrote, and it seems like all ExxonMobil just keeps popping up. Do you think that's a reason for opposition?
It's really hard to assign motive, isn't it? I mean, we have to really be careful. So I confronted a friend of mine, for example, who works for one of those ethics and public policy center groups. And I said, well, what about Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma? By the way, the fires of Oklahoma have been devastating, the heat waves of the summer and the rest, but Senator Inhofe continues to claim, and frankly, if the Republicans win the Senate tonight, James Inhofe, the ranking member of Environment and Public Works right now, in other words, in the minority party, would become the chairman again of the Energy, Environment and Public Works Committee. But this friend of mine at the Ethics and Public Policy Center said, well, how can you suggest that he takes the position he does because of the money he gets from ExxonMobil? So, because at his speeches, the very first row was filled with lobbyists from ExxonMobil, as recorded by Fast Company magazine and other places. So the lobbyists come to his speeches to authenticate that I guess their dollars are being spent, from my point of view, wisely. Money from ExxonMobil and other organizations, which now say they're not going to do that anymore. But they have spent in recent years over $40 million funding these disputations about science. So he said to me, well, how can you say that he takes that position? Maybe they give him money because he'd already come to that position. And I said, well, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. And so it's hard to assess people's motive. But you would have to conclude that when so much money is being spent in climate denial, that it doesn't have an impact. And I frankly don't believe you can begin to change this reality given the amounts of dollars that are going in. For example, in the governor's race of California, over 139 million alone in one gubernatorial race. When you see the huge amount of monies, as reported on the front page of the Washington Post, current Tea Party received in this election cycle over $500 million. Now, how much of that related to climate denial, I'm not sure. But that's an awful lot of money. And so money's driving, I believe, Capitol Hill. And so I don't know that you can ever begin to do this without public financing of elections.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri.
Hi.
I'm also Catholic, and I have heard over the past few years lots about hierarchy of issues when you go into the voting booth, lots of life issues that need to be Catholics' primary concerns. I think that politicians who are most likely to support action on climate change issues are probably likely to disagree with other evangelical positions on marriage and abortion. What sort of hierarchy of issues is climate change more important than those? What's the primary concern?
You ask a good question. You should tell me, because Catholics are known for this term prudence and prudential judgment and choosing between priorities. So I would throw it back to you. How would you answer that question? Would you concede, first of all, that they are both life issues? Not everyone would, by the way.
Certainly.
Why?
Well, it's life from the Catholic perspective, it's life in one moment now versus life years from now. So.
Oh, so there's an intergenerational issue.
Right.
The lives of those to come.
But I don't follow the Catholic line on all the issues, so I would probably, the candidates of my choice would be supportive of action on climate change, but not be supportive for keeping marriage refined to men and women, not.
In other words, you're saying you're a Democrat.
I lean that way.
So this is one of the real conundrums of faith, is it not? It's always a question of priority. And which value do you prioritize higher? Do you prioritize, for example, you could say saving the unborn? That is the traditional life issue for evangelicals, and that's all they conceive of. That's shifting. I think Jim's leadership over all these years on poverty and all the issues that Sojourners has championed, I think, has broadened the agenda for evangelicals and others, Catholics included. But there are still millions of evangelicals who think life issues means abortion only. In fact, that was one of the criticisms from Dobson, who said, I left it out, but he said, Cizik thinks it's the only issue, which was an outright lie, but it's not the only issue. You have to weigh these issues, and prudence is knowing, I think, in a certain circumstance, how to evaluate these compelling moral arguments. That's prudence. And you might also have to factor in the fact that, for me, which got me into trouble with the evangelicals, I happen to believe in the last presidential election that virtue trumped policy. So that I said in the interview that got me fired, I voted for Obama in spite of his positions on abortion and same-sex marriage, not because of them. I voted for him in spite of them because I believed that he had a presidential temperament that I felt was more trustworthy in my own judgment. But essentially, Christianity Today magazine at the time had even editorialized that before the election in a cover story, Virtue Trumps Policy. But when I announced, for example, after the election that I had voted for Obama and did so on the basis of virtue, the editor of the magazine still criticized me and said that I was off the reservation on same-sex marriage. Isn't that interesting?
Kevin, one way to relate to your question and what Rich was saying, remember he talked about straight line thinking versus more systemic or systems or sustainable thinking. The Catholic teaching that I admire the most on your question is the Bernardin, who was Cardinal of Chicago, and others talked about a consistent ethic of life or a seamless garment of life. So it's not like which issue is the most important. It's a web of ethical consistency. So when the bishops speak on a Good Friday, which they did a couple years ago, about capital punishment, they were being consistent. And the Cardinal in Chicago talked about nuclear weapons as a life issue for him, as consistent ethic of life. So when we get into the straight line thinking, abortion has to be first, and climate change is, 17th, that's when you lose the sort of the integrated thinking of a web of life. And a number of you said in your reflections this week how interconnected the issues we've been talking about are starting to feel to you. Isn't just 5 silos, but there's a connection that you're articulating now between the issues. For example, on poverty, when Rich talks about 200 million climate refugees by 2050, this is a huge dislocation issue, a poverty issue. In Darfur, the initial issue there that led to the genocide was water, drought. So the more we can think in sustainable, as you said, systems ways, the more we have to not make those choices, but have a conversation about what is really a consistent ethic of life.
See, I would say that our oil addiction By the way, that was what President Bush even said. You know, we're addicted to oil. He ought to know. But our addiction to oil as a country, as a nation, has led to environmental destruction. Witness the Gulf of Mexico in the wake of the BP disaster. It has led to endless wars. And I would say puts our very souls in jeopardy. Because we have a responsibility for the consequences of our actions. And those consequences, I would suggest, are as equally placed on us for our addiction to oil as it is for our, quick fix thinking that contributes to abortion. Because abortion is ultimately a kind of quick fix, linear thinking. It happens for a lot of different reasons of economy, poverty, and ironically, in America, half of all abortions are second and third and fourth abortions by the same woman, which leads me to say, in a policy recommendation for addressing abortion reduction strategies, that rather than trying to defund Planned Parenthood, maybe we should instead focus on attempting to meet the needs of people who are led to make that choice, which doesn't happen in Northern Europe, by the way. It's unknown, second and third abortions. But it's a kind of quick fix, short-term thinking that leads somebody to think, a woman to think she must do that. But back to my point, I would suggest that climate change is a spiritual and a moral crisis. But I would be the first to tell you that evangelical leaders who signed the Evangelical Climate Initiative, a product of Jim Ball, the president of the Evangelical Environmental Network, myself and others, there are those leaders who signed it, around 80 to 100. But generally speaking, around the country, when you figure there are 50,000 plus congregations in the National Association of Evangelicals, it would be pretty rare to find a pastor who would view climate change as a spiritual and a moral crisis. Maybe an issue. 16 or 17 on the list.